Lena had always been drawn to the idea of isolation. The quieter, the better. That's why when she heard about the old, abandoned hotel nestled deep within the woods, a part of her felt compelled to go. It wasn't just the eerie allure of the place that pulled her in, it was the weight of her past. With a failed relationship, a career that was barely holding on, and a lifetime of mistakes haunting her every step, Lena needed a place to breathe, a place to forget. The hotel, long forgotten by locals, offered the silence she craved. She had read enough about the hotel to know its history. Built in the late 1800s, it was once a luxurious retreat for the wealthy. But as time went on, it became a place of tragedy. Rumors of disappearances, strange noises in the night, and unsettling figures spotted through the cracked windows had plagued its reputation. However, Lena wasn't concerned. To her, it was just a building, a decaying structure that would allow her to retreat from the world for a few days. She would check in, stay isolated, and leave her past behind. She needed to be alone to think. She needed it more than ever. The drive was longer than she expected, the roads winding through dense forests where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground. Her car crept along the road, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath her tires. Every mile felt like it was pulling her deeper into another world. She almost expected to see shadows flickering at the corners of her vision, figures watching her from the tree line, but she knew it was nothing, just her overactive imagination. After all, she had always been a little anxious. Her mind was her worst enemy. Eventually, the trees parted, and there it was, the hotel. A tall, crumbling structure that stood alone in the middle of a clearing. Its once grand facade was now weathered by time, the windows shattered and boarded up in places, the walls streaked with dirt and neglect. A large iron gate, rusted and barely hanging on its hinges, marked the entrance. Lena felt a slight shiver run down her spine, but she brushed it off. This was it, the place she had come to escape. She parked her car by the entrance and stepped out into the cool air. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, just the sound of her own heartbeat. The hotel loomed over her, an imposing figure against the fading light of the evening. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. It would be fine. She just had to get inside, settle in, and the solitude would do the rest. The front door creaked as she pushed it open, its hinges protesting against the years of disuse. The inside was dark, save for the faint glow of the setting sun seeping through the gaps in the boarded-up windows. Dust motes floated in the air, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of grime. The once opulent lobby now looked like a forgotten relic, cracked marble floors, decaying furniture, and the faint smell of mildew. She couldn't help but feel a sense of unease creeping up her spine, but she quickly dismissed it. She wasn't here to fear ghosts or myths. She was here to get away from her own thoughts. A bell on the counter jingled as Lena approached. To her surprise, there was a man standing behind it. He was older, his face weathered and tired, his clothes simple but clean. His eyes were a dull, grayish blue, and when he spoke, his voice was low, almost gravelly. "You must be Lena," he said, his gaze piercing through her. "We've been expecting you." Lena froze, her mind scrambling to make sense of his words. "Expecting me?" She repeated, her voice a little shaky. The man gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Yes, you're the only guest we've had in years." His words sent a chill down her spine. Something about him seemed off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. He motioned toward a narrow hallway behind him. "Your room is prepared. It's been a long time since anyone stayed here. Be careful of the stairs, they're unstable." Lena nodded, too tired to ask any more questions. She just wanted to get to her room and rest. "Thank you," she said quietly before turning away. The man's gaze lingered on her as she walked down the dark hallway. For a moment, Lena felt as though his eyes were following her, but when she glanced back, he was gone. Lena's footsteps echoed down the narrow corridor, the sound unnervingly loud in the otherwise oppressive silence of the hotel. The hallway was long and winding, with doors lining either side, each one shut tight, each room sealed off from the outside world. The faint smell of mildew mixed with the earthy scent of the decaying wood, a reminder of how far gone the place truly was. The wallpaper, once a rich gold, had faded into an almost sickly yellow, peeling away at the edges like the skin of a long-forgotten corpse. She paused at the top of a set of stairs leading to the second floor and hesitated for a moment, remembering the man's warning. "Unstable stairs?" she muttered to herself, but her need for solitude pushed her forward. She had already come this far. Her mind ached for peace, for an escape from the endless looping thoughts of her past. She stepped carefully, testing each stair before moving forward, her heart thudding in her chest with each creak of the wood beneath her feet. As she reached the second floor, she could feel the temperature drop noticeably. Lena's room was at the end of the hall. The door, which she assumed had not been opened in years, was slightly ajar. She pushed it open slowly, feeling an odd, instinctive hesitation in her chest. The room was smaller than she had expected, furnished with an old iron bed frame, a small wooden desk, and a wardrobe that seemed to be holding its contents in by sheer force of will. The bed's sheets were stained with age and disuse, but they were perfectly made. No dust, no disturbance. The single window was shut tightly, but the faded light from outside managed to seep through the cracks in the wooden blinds. She placed her suitcase on the floor beside the bed, her body aching for rest. It had been a long day of driving, and though the air in the room was heavy, Lena was too exhausted to care. She flopped onto the bed, the springs groaning under her weight, and stared at the ceiling. Silence. Perfect, absolute silence. The silence, however, soon began to gnaw at her. It felt oppressive, as though the very air in the room was thickening, pressing down on her chest. Lena pulled the thin blanket over her, trying to ignore the sensation of being watched. She couldn't explain it, but every corner of the room seemed to hold something just out of sight, something that waited in the darkness. Suddenly, a soft sound broke the stillness, a scraping noise. At first, Lena thought it might have been a branch scratching against the window, but the noise was too rhythmic, too deliberate. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding. The sound came again, this time closer. Her gaze darted around the room, but she saw nothing unusual. The door was still ajar, the shadows in the corners as deep and still as before. "Probably just the house settling," she whispered to herself, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. She tried to lie back down, but the noise persisted. It was faint at first, but growing louder, almost like footsteps pacing back and forth in the hallway outside her door. Lena's breath quickened, and she cautiously moved to the edge of the bed. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and the silence returned, thick, almost suffocating. She stood, her body trembling slightly as she crept to the door and peeked out into the hallway. Nothing. The dim light from a lone flickering bulb illuminated the corridor, casting long, eerie shadows along the walls. Lena's pulse raced, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond her reach. A sudden cold draft swept through the hallway, ruffling the edges of her nightgown. She shivered involuntarily and stepped back inside her room. As she closed the door behind her, she thought she heard a whisper, a low, indistinct murmur just outside the door. Her heart skipped a beat, and she pressed her back against the wall, her hand gripping the doorknob. The murmur grew louder, now distinctly recognizable as a voice, but it was too faint to make out the words. Lena's eyes darted around the room once more, her mind reeling with possibilities. Was she imagining things? The isolation, the tension of being alone in this place, it could be affecting her. But then, a sharp, sudden knock on the door shattered her thoughts. Her heart stopped. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. There was no answer, only the deepening silence. Lena stood frozen in front of the door, the knock still echoing in her ears. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to calm her racing heart. She could feel the pulse pounding in her neck, the sweat beating on her forehead. The eerie silence that followed the knock was deafening, making her feel more alone than ever. She waited, hoping for some sign, anything that could explain what was happening, but the silence remained unbroken. She opened the door cautiously, her hand trembling as she turned the handle. The hallway was empty, not a soul in sight. The only thing that moved was the flickering light from the overhead bulb, casting distorted shadows along the cracked walls. Lena stepped out into the corridor, her feet hesitant on the creaking floorboards. She glanced down both ends of the hall, but there was no sign of anyone. Not the man from the front desk, not a soul. For a moment, Lena considered retreating back into her room and locking the door, but something compelled her to move forward. It was as if some invisible force was drawing her down the dark hallway. She had to know what was going on, what had caused the unsettling noises and the strange knock. She wasn't sure if it was her curiosity or some deeper, more primal instinct that kept pushing her forward, but she couldn't ignore it. As she walked down the hall, the temperature seemed to drop even further, the cold creeping through her clothes and biting at her skin. The doors lining the hallway were still closed, each one standing like silent sentinels. Yet, as she passed one door, she thought she heard something faint, a soft whisper coming from inside. Her steps faltered. Lena hesitated, her fingers curling around the doorknob. She almost pulled her hand away, but then she pushed the door open, her breath caught in her throat. Inside, the room was darker than the others, the air thick with an oppressive weight. There was a low, droning hum that seemed to reverberate from the walls. A strange metallic smell lingered in the air. The room was almost entirely empty, save for a small weathered mirror hanging crookedly on the far wall. A chill ran down her spine as she crossed the threshold, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She felt it again. That sensation of being watched. Lena glanced around nervously, but there was no one there. The only sound was the distant hum, like an old, malfunctioning machine. She approached the mirror, her reflection distorted in the dim light. It was an old, tarnished frame, the glass cracked in several places. Yet, as she stared into it, something caught her eye. The faintest movement, just a flicker. A shadow that seemed to pass by in the reflection, though when she turned around, the room was empty. Her heart raced, her pulse pounded in her ears. She backed away from the mirror slowly, a sense of dread creeping up on her. As she turned to leave, the hum grew louder, and Lena felt an overwhelming compulsion to look back. But this time, as she glanced over her shoulder, she saw it. Clear as day, a figure standing just behind her reflection, its outline barely visible against the cracked glass. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in tattered clothing that seemed to blend into the darkness of the room. The face was obscured, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. Her breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. She spun around, but the figure was gone, vanished into thin air. The room was empty once more. Lena bolted for the door, her legs unsteady as she rushed down the hallway. The hum in the room faded into the distance, but the feeling of being pursued, of being hunted, remained. She had to get back to her room. She had to get out of there. The whispers and strange knocks were no coincidence. Something in this hotel wanted her. Something that she couldn't see. Something ancient and powerful. When she reached her room, she slammed the door shut behind her and locked it. She leaned against it, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. What was happening? Her mind raced, but the answers eluded her. She knew something was terribly wrong with this place, but she couldn't figure out what. It was as if the hotel itself was alive, watching, waiting for her to break. As Lena collapsed onto the bed, her body shaking with fear, she noticed something strange. The room, which had been bathed in the dull light of the dying day, now seemed darker, almost unnatural. The shadows on the walls stretched longer than before, twisting and curling like tendrils of smoke. She blinked, and for a moment, the shadows seemed to take on shapes, human shapes. Faces. "Get out," a voice whispered from the corner of the room, barely audible. Lena's eyes widened and she spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the endless stretch of darkness and the oppressive weight of something watching her. She was not alone. The voice in the corner echoed in Lena's mind, ringing louder than the deafening silence. "Get out." The words felt like ice running down her spine, and for a moment she froze, unable to move, unable to think. The shadows in the room seemed to press in on her, growing thicker, darker, more suffocating with each breath. Her mind raced as she tried to comprehend what was happening. She wasn't imagining this. It was real. Someone was in the room with her. She could feel it, feel the weight of its presence. The shadows continued to stretch and twist along the walls, morphing into grotesque shapes that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Lena's breathing grew shallow, her chest tightening as panic took hold. She had to get out. The door was still locked, and the only way out was to face whatever horror lurked in the hallway. But the hallway itself felt like a death trap, a place where the walls themselves whispered threats. Her mind spun with thoughts of the hotel's history, of the strange occurrences, the disappearances, the whispers, the knocks, the figure in the mirror. It all made sense now. This place wasn't just abandoned, it was cursed, trapped, and she had walked right into it. She had been drawn to it like a moth to a flame, and now she was paying the price. Lena bolted upright, her body trembling from head to toe. She had no choice but to face whatever waited outside. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let it consume her. But the moment her feet hit the floor, the door to her room slammed open with a deafening bang, as if the hotel itself had rejected her attempt to escape. Lena's blood ran cold. Standing in the doorway, illuminated by the flickering light of the hallway, was the figure from the mirror. Tall, thin, and dressed in tattered rags, its face obscured by darkness. It took a step forward, and Lena felt her body freeze in place, her legs refusing to move. The figure's head tilted unnaturally, as though studying her. Then, in a voice that sounded both distant and near, it spoke again, the words a rasping whisper. "You cannot leave." Lena's breath caught in her throat. Panic surged through her as she tried to retreat, but her body refused to cooperate. Every part of her screamed to run, to fight, but she was paralyzed with fear, trapped in the grip of something ancient and powerful. The figure took another step closer, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. For a brief moment, Lena could see its face, a hollow, empty void where eyes should have been. A face that seemed to be both human and something else entirely. The whispers around her grew louder, voices overlapping in an unintelligible chant. She could feel the temperature drop even further, the cold seeping into her bones, numbing her from the inside out. The figure reached out with a skeletal hand, its fingers elongating as it moved toward her. "Please," Lena whispered, her voice trembling, her throat dry. "Please, just let me go." But the figure didn't respond. It simply stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. Lena felt the room spin, her vision blurring. She could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears as the figure loomed above her. Just as its cold fingers brushed against her skin, something inside Lena snapped. A surge of adrenaline flooded her body, pushing the fear aside. She didn't have time to think. She didn't have time to question what was real and what was not. All that mattered was escaping. With a strangled cry, Lena shoved the figure away, her hands colliding with its chest. For a moment, she thought it would collapse under the force, but instead it seemed to dissipate into the air, vanishing like smoke. The temperature in the room returned to normal, the oppressive weight lifting, but the fear remained. Lena didn't hesitate. She turned and bolted for the door, her feet pounding against the floor as she rushed into the hallway. The corridor stretched out before her, but she could barely see where she was going. The hallway was now an endless expanse of darkness. The doors on either side blurred and shifting like mirages. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the floorboards creaked ominously beneath her feet. She ran. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The stairs were ahead. She could hear the creaking wood beneath her as she descended. But she pushed forward, faster now, her legs burning with effort. She had to get out, had to get to the front door. It was the only way to escape this nightmare. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw the front door in the distance, bathed in the faint light of the moon. Her heart soared with hope until the door slammed shut on its own, the lock snapping into place with a loud final click. Lena screamed, her voice echoing through the hall, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. Behind her, the faintest sound of footsteps approached. She turned to face whatever had come for her, her breath ragged and her chest heaving. But she wasn't alone. The man from the front desk stood at the top of the stairs, his face expressionless, and behind him a shadow moved, a dark, writhing mass that seemed to pulsate with an unnatural energy. "You shouldn't have come," the man said, his voice cold. "Now you belong to it." Lena's eyes widened in realization as the shadow advanced, swallowing the light and closing in around her. The last thing she saw, before everything went dark, was the reflection of her own terrified face in the cracked mirror on the wall. And then, silence. The hotel waited. Samantha Reynolds stood at the edge of the winding, overgrown path, staring at the hulking, decrepit building before her. The former luxury hotel, now abandoned for nearly 3 decades, loomed like a shadowy sentinel against the backdrop of the darkening forest. Once known as the Crestwood, it had been a high-end getaway for the rich and famous in its heyday, but now it was little more than a decaying monument to the past. Yet, despite its sorry state, Samantha could not shake the feeling that it was alive, waiting. The evening air was thick with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, and the setting sun bathed the hotel in a sickly orange light. For years, Samantha had heard the stories, whispers about the strange disappearances of guests, rumors of hauntings, of things that lurked in the walls and under the floorboards. She'd always dismissed them as mere gossip, until now. The invitation she had received only a week earlier had shaken her to her core. "Come to the Crestwood," it had read. "Find what was lost." Her mind swirled with questions. Who had sent the letter? Why had she been chosen? And most importantly, what was hidden in the bowels of the hotel that needed to be found? She couldn't turn back now. Her curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, had pushed her here. The past had a way of pulling you back, whether you wanted it or not. "Are you sure about this?" A voice behind her broke the silence. It was Jason, her closest friend and reluctant companion. He had insisted on accompanying her after she had mentioned her decision to explore the hotel. Although he had little interest in the supernatural, his protective instincts had won out. Samantha turned to face him, offering a reassuring smile, though her stomach churned with unease. "We've come this far, Jason. We might as well finish it." Her voice wavered slightly, betraying the nervousness she felt, but she quickly masked it with a more confident tone. "Besides, what's the worst that could happen?" Jason frowned, but said nothing more. He had learned over the years that when Samantha set her mind on something, there was no stopping her. He would stay by her side, whether he liked it or not. The door to the hotel creaked ominously as they pushed it open. Dust and cobwebs greeted them, the smell of mildew and decay lingering in the air. The grand chandelier above them had long since lost its luster, the once pristine marble floors now cracked and covered in layers of grime. But what caught Samantha's eye first were the portraits on the walls. Each one seemed to depict the same group of people, a smiling couple with their children. The faces were slightly obscured by the passage of time, but they still exuded an eerie presence. "That's strange," Jason muttered, his gaze fixed on the paintings. "Do you think they still live here?" Samantha shook her head. "No one has lived here for years." She paused, running her fingers along the peeling wallpaper. "But it feels like they're still here, doesn't it?" Jason didn't answer. He was already moving deeper into the lobby, his steps quickening as though the building were pushing him to hurry. Samantha followed, the dim light from their flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. As they moved through the hotel's long, winding halls, the sense of being watched grew stronger. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. It wasn't long before they found the staircase leading up to the upper floors. A rusted railing ran alongside it, and the steps looked as if they might give way with the slightest pressure. Yet Samantha felt an undeniable pull to ascend. She had to know what lay at the top. The second floor was colder than the first, the temperature drop immediate as they entered the hallway. The rooms on either side were sealed shut, but one door stood ajar, as if inviting them in. Samantha hesitated, but Jason had already stepped forward, pushing the door open with a force that startled her. The room inside was bathed in shadow, the only light coming from their flashlights, casting long, grotesque shadows across the walls. The air was thick, as if the room hadn't been disturbed in decades. But what made Samantha's breath catch in her throat was the figure sitting in the far corner. It was an old woman, her face hidden in the folds of her tattered shawl, her frail hands clasped tightly in her lap. The old woman didn't move, her body hunched in the corner like a forgotten relic. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest, a cold shiver crawling down her spine. She exchanged a nervous glance with Jason, who seemed equally unsettled but stepped forward nonetheless. His voice was barely a whisper as he spoke. "Hello? Are you all right?" The woman's head twitched, and for a moment Samantha thought she'd imagined it. But then the woman lifted her head slowly, revealing eyes that were as empty as the hotel itself, voids of blackness that swallowed any trace of humanity. Her lips parted, but the words that came out were not what Samantha had expected. "Leave this place," the woman rasped, her voice crackling like dry leaves in the wind. "It will consume you. It consumes everything." Jason froze in his tracks, his hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight in his pocket. Samantha felt a surge of adrenaline course through her, but her feet were rooted to the spot. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get out of the room and away from the woman, but something kept her there. Perhaps it was fear, or maybe it was the curiosity that had driven her to this forsaken place. "Who are you?" Samantha asked, her voice trembling despite her attempts to sound calm. "What do you mean by it? What's happening here?" The woman's head tilted, as if considering the question. "It is the thing that waits," she murmured. "The thing that wakes when you return. The hotel has been waiting for you. It is hungry." Jason's hand hovered near the door handle, but he didn't dare leave. "We shouldn't stay here," he muttered, his voice thick with unease. "This place, it's wrong." Samantha wanted to agree with him, to turn around and flee, but the woman's words held her in place. Something was pulling her deeper into the mystery, deeper into the hotel. She had to know more. "What do you want from us?" Samantha asked, her voice steadier now, though it still trembled beneath the surface. She stepped forward, drawn to the woman despite the growing sense of dread that gnawed at her. The old woman's lips curled into a grotesque smile, her yellowed teeth glinting in the dim light. "I want nothing, but it does. And you've already started it. You will see it soon enough." Samantha felt a chill spread through her bones as the woman's words hung in the air. She could feel the oppressive weight of something ancient and malevolent pressing down on her chest. Something was watching them from the darkness, something far older than the hotel itself. It was as if the very walls of the building were alive, pulsing with a dark energy that she couldn't comprehend. Jason's voice broke through her thoughts. "Samantha, we need to go, now." But as he turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside the room. Samantha spun around, her heart racing, and saw that the woman was no longer in the corner. She had vanished, leaving only the faint smell of decay behind. "What the hell?" Jason hissed, backing away from the door. "This place is insane." Samantha tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. She pulled harder, but it was as if the door had fused with the wall itself. Panic began to rise within her, but she pushed it down, forcing herself to focus. There had to be a way out. There always was. She glanced around the room, her eyes landing on a small wooden desk in the far corner. There, nestled beneath a pile of old papers, was a weathered book. It looked like a journal, its leather cover cracked and faded with age. Samantha felt an odd compulsion to open it. Something told her it would hold the answers. Jason watched her with wide eyes, his voice tense. "What are you doing? We need to get out of here." But Samantha couldn't stop herself. She picked up the journal, her fingers brushing against its surface. The moment she touched it, she felt a jolt of electricity shoot through her arm. She gasped, dropping the book onto the desk as if it had burned her. "What the hell was that?" Jason demanded, stepping toward her. Samantha's hands shook as she reached for the journal again, but this time she carefully opened it. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, though the ink had bled over the years, making the words difficult to read. But one thing was clear. It was a log, a record of events from the hotel's past. She read aloud the first entry she could make out. August 23rd, 1984. "The guests have begun to disappear. I don't know what it is, but something in this place is calling to them. It speaks to them in their sleep. We must leave before it gets us too." The next entry was no clearer, but one word stood out, written in frantic, almost desperate letters. "It." Before Samantha could read more, the room grew colder. The hairs on her neck stood on end, and the flashlight flickered out, plunging them into complete darkness. A low growl echoed through the room, followed by a distant scraping sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. The darkness enveloped them like a thick, suffocating blanket. Samantha's breath came in shallow gasps, her hands trembling as she fumbled for the flashlight. Jason's voice cracked through the silence, strained with fear. "What was that? What the hell was that sound?" His voice was tight, almost frantic as he backed away from the door. Samantha could barely see him in the pitch-black room, but she could hear his breathing quickening. She felt her own heart pounding against her chest, each beat louder than the last. Her mind raced. The growl, the scraping, there was something in this room with them, something alive, and it wasn't human. "I don't know," Samantha whispered, her voice barely audible. Her hands found the flashlight, and with a trembling flick of her wrist, it flared to life once more. The beam cut through the room, revealing the familiar surroundings. The desk, the cracked walls, the rotting furniture. But everything felt different now. The air was thicker, the shadows longer, as if the room itself had shifted. A creak came from behind them. Slowly, reluctantly, Samantha turned. The door, the one they had tried to leave through, was now partially open. But it wasn't the door that drew her gaze. It was the figure standing just beyond it. A tall, gaunt silhouette loomed in the doorway. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but Samantha could feel its presence. Malignant, hungry, her blood ran cold. This was no ordinary person. No human could stand so still, so unnaturally silent. "Samantha." Jason's voice quivered behind her. "What is that?" Samantha's breath caught in her throat as the figure began to move. It was slow at first, dragging its feet as it crossed the threshold into the room. With each step, the shadows seemed to writhe, twisting unnaturally in the dim light. The figure's outline flickered like a broken film reel, as though it were struggling to hold its shape. Before she could react, it spoke. The voice that emerged was not human, it was distorted, as though multiple voices were layered over one another. The words were garbled, incomprehensible at first, but then they became clear, chilling. "You've awakened me," the thing rasped, its voice a twisted amalgamation of fear and malice. "You should not have come." Samantha staggered back, her eyes wide with terror. The thing moved toward them with a sudden, jerky motion, its limbs contorting unnaturally, like a marionette with broken strings. The flashlight's beam flickered, the darkness seeming to push back against the light. "We need to get out of here," Jason shouted, panic rising in his voice. But Samantha couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her mind screaming at her to run, to leave, but her body refused to obey. She could feel the presence of the thing growing stronger, suffocating the air around her. The figure stopped just in front of them, its face still obscured by shadows. For a moment, there was an eerie stillness in the air, as if the world itself had frozen. Then, in a voice that sent a shiver down Samantha's spine, the creature spoke again, its tone low and mocking. "You think you can escape? This place will never let you go, not until it has what it wants." Samantha's blood ran cold as she realized what the thing meant. She had been drawn here, and now there was no way out. The hotel had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many others before her. The creature raised one long, bony arm, its fingers stretching out like the claws of some predatory beast. It reached for Samantha, and as it did, a wave of coldness washed over her, like the touch of death itself. She stumbled backward, gasping for air, but she couldn't break free. The thing's presence was overwhelming, its grip tightening around her chest. "Get away from her." Jason's voice broke through the fog of terror, and suddenly, he was there, pulling Samantha toward the door. The creature hissed, a sound that was both inhuman and chilling. "You cannot stop it. It has already begun." With one last desperate effort, Jason wrenched the door open and pulled Samantha into the hallway. The thing's shriek echoed behind them, a sound that seemed to reverberate in their bones. But as they stumbled out of the room, the door slammed shut, cutting off the creature's terrible wail. They ran. Samantha didn't know where they were going, only that they had to escape. The hotel seemed to shift and warp around them as they sprinted through the dark, labyrinthine corridors. The walls seemed to close in, and the floorboards groaned under their feet, but they kept running. "Why is this happening?" Jason gasped, looking over his shoulder as though expecting the creature to appear at any moment. "We don't even know what we're up against." Samantha didn't have an answer. The hotel was alive. That much was certain. But the deeper question remained. What had they awakened? What was waiting for them, hidden in the depths of the Crestwood? They rounded a corner and found themselves in a grand ballroom, its once beautiful chandelier now shattered, pieces of glass scattered across the floor like forgotten memories. In the center of the room, a large, ornate mirror stood, its surface cracked, but still reflecting the dim light from their flashlights. Samantha stopped dead in her tracks, her heart hammering. The reflection in the mirror wasn't theirs. It was the woman, the old woman from the room. But her face was twisted, her eyes wide and dark, her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. "You shouldn't have come," the reflection whispered, her voice a cold, mocking echo. "It's too late now." The air in the ballroom grew colder still, the temperature dropping so rapidly that Samantha's breath became visible in the flashlight's beam. Her skin prickled with cold sweat, and she felt as if the walls themselves were closing in, drawing her into an inescapable web. Jason gripped her arm tightly, his eyes wide with panic. But Samantha couldn't tear her gaze away from the reflection in the cracked mirror. The woman, her twisted reflection, was still there, smiling that awful, knowing grin. This isn't possible," Samantha murmured, her voice trembling. "It's just a reflection, it's just a trick." But deep down, she knew it wasn't. There was something in the hotel, something dark and ancient, and it was toying with them, drawing them closer to its grasp. The reflection of the woman in the mirror began to move, her figure slowly stepping away from the glass as if the barrier between the real world and the twisted version of it had dissolved. Samantha staggered backward, her heart racing. "Run, Sam!" Jason screamed, pulling her by the arm toward the door. "We need to get out of here, now." But as they turned to flee, the mirror seemed to distort, the reflections of the room warping into grotesque, unfamiliar shapes. The chandelier above them began to sway, its glass bulbs rattling as if it were caught in an unseen storm. The floor beneath their feet trembled, and the distant sound of something scraping against the walls filled the room. They were no longer alone. Samantha's blood ran cold as figures began to materialize in the mirror. Hundreds of them, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes pleading, begging for release. They were the lost souls of the hotel's past guests, trapped in the cursed place, their forms fading in and out of existence. Jason's breath hitched as he turned to face her, his voice shaking. We're not getting out of here, are we?" Samantha opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She could feel the presence of the hotel closing in around them, the walls alive with the tortured souls of those who had entered the Crestwood and never returned. The air grew heavy, oppressive, and Samantha knew, deep in her gut, that she had made a terrible mistake. The hotel had been waiting for them, for her, and now there was no escape. "We have to break it," Samantha whispered, her voice low and determined. "We have to destroy it." Jason looked at her, confusion flashing in his eyes. "Destroy what?" "The mirror," Samantha said, pointing toward the cracked reflection. "It's holding them here. It's holding us here. If we don't destroy it, we'll never get out." Without waiting for him to respond, Samantha grabbed a nearby chair and swung it toward the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, the sound reverberating through the ballroom. As the pieces of the mirror fell to the ground, the figures inside screamed, their voices rising in an agonizing chorus. The air became thick with the stench of decay, the cold so intense it cut through her like a blade. But even as the mirror shattered, something else began to shift. The walls of the ballroom seemed to pulse, the lights flickering wildly as the floor beneath their feet gave a low, ominous groan. The hotel was fighting back. It was angry, and it was desperate. Sam, we need to go, now!" Jason screamed, his voice rising in panic. But as Samantha turned toward the door, she felt a tugging at her feet, as if invisible hands were reaching out from the darkness, pulling her back. She looked down in horror as the floor seemed to split open, revealing a swirling abyss beneath them. The hotel wasn't going to let them leave. Samantha yanked her feet free from the grip of the dark force, but the floor continued to buckle and warp beneath them. "Jason, go! I'll hold it off," she shouted, pushing him toward the door. "No!" Jason protested, his voice frantic. "We're in this together." But Samantha shook her head, desperation in her eyes. "You can't save me, Jason. It's too late. You have to get out of here while you can." Jason hesitated, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hope. But then the floor gave way completely, and with a final gut-wrenching scream, Samantha was pulled into the black void. Her body twisted and jerked as if being dragged through thick, sticky darkness. and she fought with every ounce of strength she had left to break free. She didn't know how long she fell or how far. Time seemed to stretch, bend, and break around her as she was pulled deeper into the abyss. But through the darkness, one thing became clear. The hotel had won. It had taken her, and now she was a part of its twisted history, another soul trapped within its decaying walls. Jason stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the spot where Samantha had disappeared. He didn't move, didn't speak. His mind was numb, his body trembling from the terror of what he had just witnessed. The hotel was silent now, its whispers fading into the distance. It had claimed what it wanted. For a long time, Jason didn't know what to do. The world outside the Crestwood felt like a distant memory. And yet the hotel's grip was still there, lingering in the back of his mind, in the corners of his vision. He had to leave, had to get away, but something told him that no matter where he went, the hotel would always follow. The Crestwood had claimed its victims, and now there would be no more escape. Hannah had heard rumors about the old Remington Hotel, tucked away in the forgotten corner of the forest. Whispers of strange happenings had surfaced over the years, but they were always dismissed as nothing more than local folklore. That was until a cryptic letter arrived at her doorstep, handwritten in an unfamiliar shaking hand. "Come if you dare. It is waiting." No return address, no explanation, just a chilling invitation. It had been nearly a decade since she'd stepped foot in that town, since the last summer she had spent there as a child, before the tragic disappearance of her sister. Her parents never spoke of it again, but the events of that summer had haunted her dreams, feeding an insatiable curiosity. She had to go back, even if it meant facing the memories that still made her skin crawl. The hotel was rumored to be the site of several unexplained disappearances, and somehow, Hannah knew it was connected to her sister's vanishing. The hotel loomed in front of her as she arrived that evening, its silhouette dark against the fading sky. It had once been a grand establishment, bustling with life and luxury. Now, it stood as a decaying monument to forgotten times. Windows were boarded up, vines crawled up the cracked brick exterior, and a cold wind howled through the empty halls. The sight made her heart race, but she steeled herself. She had a mission, and it was far too late to turn back now. As Hannah stepped through the rusted gates, the weight of silence pressed down on her. The crunch of gravel beneath her boots was the only sound as she approached the grand front doors, which creaked ominously as they swung open. She hesitated for a moment before entering, a chill running down her spine. Inside, the hotel was even more desolate, a cavernous echo of its former grandeur. The air smelled of mildew and decay, and the faint traces of once velvety curtains hung like ghosts in the empty windows. A strange feeling overtook her as she crossed the threshold. It was as though the hotel itself was waiting for her, watching her every move. The walls seemed to hum with some kind of quiet energy, and a strange unease settled in the pit of her stomach. She pulled out the letter again, her fingers trembling as she read its words once more. "Come if you dare." Whoever had written it had known she would come, but why? What had she truly come to find? The lobby was enormous, but everything about it was in ruins. A grand chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals shattered, casting fractured reflections on the walls. A massive staircase spiraled upward, its banister rotted and sagging. At the base of the stairs, an old, cracked mirror reflected her image. But as she stared into it, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Behind her, just out of sight, a shadow seemed to move. It flickered, then vanished as quickly as it had appeared. A voice broke the silence, a low whisper that made her heart skip. "You're not alone, you know." She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. No one was there. Hannah's pulse quickened, but she steadied herself. It was just the wind, or perhaps a trick of her mind. Yet, that nagging feeling refused to leave, the feeling that someone was out there, just beyond her reach, waiting. Hannah's breath was shallow, her mind racing to process everything she had seen. The strange photographs, the cryptic voice, the overwhelming sensation of being watched. It was as if the hotel was alive and feeding off her fear. She stood in the dim room, the suitcase clutched tightly in her hands, her fingers numb from the cold. The words, "You shouldn't be here," echoed in her mind, louder than any sound she had heard in her life. She wasn't sure what she was meant to find, but she knew now that the hotel had something to reveal. Something terrifying. Determined not to let fear control her, Hannah shoved the suitcase back into the wardrobe and shut the door. The photograph of her sister, the one she had found earlier, still burned in her mind. She had to know more. She had to understand how it all connected. But the longer she stayed here, the more she realized she wasn't just searching for answers. She was running out of time. The hallway outside seemed darker now, as though the building itself was closing in around her. The walls, once elegant and grand, now seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as though they were alive, breathing in time with her anxious heartbeats. She needed to find a way out, but there was no clear exit. Only more hallways, more doors that led to rooms of forgotten memories. Then she noticed something strange at the end of the corridor. A door, different from all the others. It was ornate, with intricate carvings of swirling vines and faces she couldn't quite make out. At the center of the door was a large, polished mirror, its surface reflecting nothing but the hallway in front of her. But as she stepped closer, the reflection in the glass shifted, distorting into a blur. For a brief moment, Hannah thought she saw a figure standing behind her in the reflection. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway stretching into darkness. Against every instinct screaming at her to leave, Hannah pushed the door open. The room beyond was unlike any other in the hotel. It was enormous, with walls lined floor to ceiling with mirrors. The mirrors reflected not just the room, but fragments of her own fear. Her face twisted in panic, her eyes wide with terror. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she stepped inside, her shoes clicking softly on the marble floor. The mirrors seemed to distort everything, angles warped, reflections moving out of sync with her own movements. But as she looked into one of them, her stomach turned. In the mirror, the reflection of the room appeared different. It was as though the hotel had changed. The walls were no longer decaying but pristine, the chandeliers above sparkling as though they were brand new. And in the center of the room stood a woman, a figure that looked almost exactly like her sister. Hannah's heart stopped. Her sister's face was just as she remembered it, innocent, full of life, but she hadn't seen her in years. The woman in the mirror smiled, and Hannah's breath caught in her throat. "Lena?" Her voice cracked as she whispered her sister's name. The reflection smiled wider, but the eyes, those eyes, they were empty, hollow, and dead. And just as quickly as it had appeared, the image of her sister in the mirror vanished, leaving only the distorted, flickering reflection of the room. Hannah stumbled backward, her pulse pounding in her ears. No, this isn't possible," she muttered to herself. She turned to leave, but the door was gone. The hallway beyond was a blur of shadows, and the only thing that remained was the endless stretch of mirrors. A deep, guttural voice boomed from the depths of the room, shaking her to her core. "You found what you were meant to find. You should have never come here." Suddenly, the mirrors around her began to crack. The glass shattered, one by one, sending sharp shards of reflection flying across the room. A cold wind whipped through the space, extinguishing the faint light that had illuminated the mirrors. In the chaos, a figure appeared, stepping from the shadows at the far side of the room. The tall, gaunt shape moved slowly toward her, its long, thin fingers reaching out like claws. Its eyes glowed faintly with an unnatural light, and its smile was wide and predatory. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just some twisted memory. It was something alive, something that had been waiting for her. The air in the lobby seemed thicker now, as if the hotel itself was drawing in a deep, silent breath. Hannah felt the weight of time pressing in on her, as if the walls were holding memories of long-gone guests, the echoes of their lives and deaths reverberating through the rooms. She took a hesitant step forward, the floorboards groaning under her weight, and as she walked deeper into the heart of the building, the silence was broken only by the distant sound of water dripping somewhere above. The farther she ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It wasn't just the physical decay of the hotel that unnerved her. It was the pervasive feeling that the building was not as empty as it appeared. Each room she passed felt alive with secrets. Some doors were slightly ajar, the faintest light spilling out from cracks in the frames, while others were sealed shut with layers of dust and grime. Her pulse raced as she caught sight of a door at the end of the hall, one that looked as though it had been untouched for years, yet faint shadows moved inside it. Hannah's hand reached for the handle, her fingers cold against the tarnished brass. She hesitated, a part of her warning her to leave well enough alone. But the pull was irresistible. She twisted the knob, and the door creaked open. Inside, the room was dark, except for the dim glow of a single flickering lamp. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the air was thick with the musty scent of disuse. A heavy wooden wardrobe stood in the corner, its doors slightly ajar. As she approached, the floorboards creaked under her feet, and she felt as though something, or someone, was watching her. Her breath caught in her throat as she pulled the wardrobe door open. There, lying on the floor, was an old suitcase. It was battered and worn, its leather cracked and faded. Hesitant, she knelt down and opened it. Inside was a collection of photographs, each one yellowed with age. She picked one up, her fingers trembling as she examined it. The photo was of a man and a woman, standing in front of the very hotel she was in, their faces full of life. But what chilled her to the bone was the date written in the corner, July 17th, 1953, the same date her sister had disappeared. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Was this a sign? Was the hotel somehow connected to her sister's disappearance? As she flipped through more photos, she noticed something strange. Each photo had a name scrawled on the back, but the names were unfamiliar. And yet, they all seemed to have been taken at the hotel. The same hotel. The door behind her slammed shut with a deafening bang, sending her heart into her throat. She spun around, but no one was there. The silence was now overwhelming, like the building itself had exhaled in relief. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the photographs, the strange sensations, the voices she'd heard. It was as though the hotel was alive, breathing with memories of those who had stayed there, those who had never left. Suddenly, she heard a faint sound, a soft whisper. It was so quiet, so subtle, that at first, she wasn't sure she had heard it at all. But then it came again, louder this time. "You shouldn't be here." Hannah froze. The voice was unmistakable, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Her heart pounded in her chest as she quickly turned to face the empty room. But again, there was no one there. She knew then that she had made a terrible mistake. This was no ordinary hotel. It was a prison for the lost, a place where the past never truly died. And now, she was part of its dark history. The figure in the shattered mirrors moved closer, its long fingers stretched out like the skeletal hands of a forgotten ghost. Its face was a blur, a grotesque shape that seemed to shift with each passing second. Hannah's heart pounded in her chest, her instincts screaming for her to run, but her legs felt like lead. The room seemed to close in on her, the cracked mirrors now reflecting multiple versions of the same nightmare. 100 shadows of the creature, all reaching for her. "You shouldn't have come," the voice whispered, its tone low and venomous. It was as if the hotel itself was speaking to her, its ancient walls alive with the voices of the lost. "But now that you have, there is no escape." Hannah's breath came in ragged gasps as she backed away, her hands pressed against her chest as if trying to still her racing heart. The figure continued to advance, the faint glow from its eyes growing brighter. She tried to force herself to move, but her body refused to cooperate. She could feel the cold, sharp presence of the entity closing in on her, and every instinct screamed at her to flee. Yet, there was no place to run. The room was closing in, the mirrors shifting in impossible ways, trapping her in this maddening maze of reflections. With a sudden burst of clarity, a memory flashed in her mind, one she hadn't thought about in years. It was a night from her childhood, when she and her sister Lena had ventured into the woods near their family's cabin. They'd found a hidden clearing, a place that felt wrong from the moment they stepped into it. The air had been thick, oppressive, and though they'd heard nothing, there was something in the silence, something that felt like it was watching them. That night had been the last time Hannah saw Lena. Her sister had disappeared without a trace, and the authorities had found no evidence of foul play. But now, in the mirror-filled room, it all clicked. The hotel, the disappearing guests, the cryptic letter, it all connected to that one forgotten night. "You're not the first to be drawn here," the voice said again, louder this time. "This place claims those with unfinished business. And you." It stopped as though it were savoring the words. "You belong to it now." A chill washed over Hannah, but she clenched her fists, summoning every ounce of courage she had left. She couldn't let herself be consumed by this place. Not like her sister, not like all the others. She had to break free. But how? In that moment, a new realization hit her. The mirrors, the reflection of the room, had shown her Lena's face, but it had been distorted, hollow. The entity in front of her, the thing that was once human, was a result of this place, a twisted mockery of the souls it had claimed. Her sister had been absorbed into it, her soul forever trapped within the hotel's cursed walls. And now it wanted Hannah too. With a final surge of strength, Hannah turned and bolted toward the far wall, her feet pounding the floor as she raced for the door that no longer existed. But as she reached the spot where it had been, she found only solid stone. Her hands scraped against the cold surface in desperation. The creature was right behind her now, its cold breath brushing against her neck. But as it reached for her, something strange happened. The mirrors around her shattered all at once, and a blinding light filled the room, blurring her vision. She squeezed her eyes shut, feeling the intense pressure of the light pushing against her. The last thing she heard before everything went white was a voice, familiar and soft, calling her name. "Hannah." When the light finally faded, Hannah found herself standing in the middle of the lobby, the hotel silent once more. The air was still thick with decay, but the oppressive energy had lifted. She looked around, confused, her mind reeling. The mirrors, the creature, the terrifying realization, had it all been a hallucination? Had it been a part of the hotel's twisted influence? But as she turned to leave, her gaze fell upon a photograph on the wall, a faded picture of the hotel's early days. And there, in the corner of the frame, was a familiar face. Lena's. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She hadn't been the first to come here, but she had been the last to leave. Hannah's footsteps echoed in the empty hall as she walked toward the exit, the weight of the hotel's truth heavy on her shoulders. She had come to find answers, but what she had discovered was far more than she had ever expected. The Remington Hotel was not just a place, it was a prison for the lost, a final resting place for those with unfinished business. And Hannah, now more than ever, understood that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again.